Yeah, thank you for the nice intro. And hi, everyone. Welcome to my talk, Steady State with Ember Octane. In this talk, I want to talk with you about state management and Ember components and how the first edition of Ember, Ember Octane, can actually help you to maintain, manage, and also build on top of your components in a much more sustainable way in your application. In this talk, I want to highlight some of the things that Ember Octane itself brings, but also some patterns you can actually use in your application yourself to make it more sustainable. And yeah, before we get started, of course, a few words about myself. My name is Jessica Jordan. I'm a senior front-end engineer working at simplabs. We are a European-based consultancy helping people with their Ruby and Rails, Phoenix Elixir, but also the Ember applications. I'm also a member of the Ember Learning team, where I mostly work on the Ember Times newsletter, which is a great resource if you want to keep up to date what's happening in the community. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I would highly encourage you to do this right now. And let's actually get into the topic. When I was looking into preparing this talk, I was thinking to myself it would actually be really good to kind of reconfirm what we actually talk about when we use the term state. Because state is something that for a long time, in web development, has maybe not, especially in the front-end development world, not be such a big buzzword, but since the rise of JavaScript frameworks actually made it possible to extend a lot of business logic into a client, state is becoming a more and more important topic. And state in general is a very broad topic you can just get from computer science or any other kind of computer science related topics. And if you look at a definition, for example, we could come up with something like this. It's a program that is described as stateful if it's designed to remember preceding events or user interactions. And this kind of information that is actually stored to remember these events, this is what we in the end call state. So any kind of parameters, variables, objects, any kind of thing in our program that can actually store values and change depending on user events or any kinds of interactions, this is what we, in the sum of it all, actually describe as state. And state is really important to us, as Ember developers. In general, as people who actually write programs. And if we think about these parameters in the programs that we write, for example, variables, we know that they can exist, they can change their values over time, and they oftentimes don't only stand on their own in the application. Instead, we have a lot of different other parameters as well that can exist at the same time as a single parameter that can change. And oftentimes we also find that the applications that we write actually also influence each other, or the parameters in the application influence each other. So each single parameter in an application can, for example, assert a certain value and then also can interact with other parameters in the application and therefore impact the value of it or its state. And subsequently, we can also see oftentimes when state actually changes the application, these certain parameters also have influences on other parts of the application, on other parameters, be objects or values or any kind of other parameters. In JavaScript applications, this oftentimes happens due to user interactions, maybe also navigation through an application, events, and also incoming network requests can actually change the state of our data layer and therefore also impact application-wise the state of our app. And thinking more specifically about how this works out in JavaScript applications, we find there are maybe 4 main categories of states. First of all, local states. So this is everything that we have, for example, residing in a function or maybe in a block where we kind of have variables that are only available in this certain local state. We also have closure state for example, closure functions. We have object state, anything that is stored in objects and it's available in this certain object, and as well as global state, something that is stored on our window object and can be available to all kinds of functions, other objects, and also applications that are currently running on this specific page. If we think about state in Ember apps, something that we oftentimes think about among local state, closure state, and global state is object state. And this is also something that I want to focus on in this talk because I want to mainly talk about how we can actually manage component state and how Ember Octane actually can help us with this. And looking more specifically at object state, we find that there might be 3 main categories. You might also find that there might be others. Feel free to discuss with me like after the talk. But in my opinion, the 3 main ones are the service state. So this is something like a state object that actually allows us to maintain state application-wide over the longevity of the whole application. Then we also have like controller state, anything that is related to a certain route or a certain page. And also we have component state, which we want to kind of like further focus on. If we manage component state, we have a lot of like different parameters that we can actually change or like manipulate over the lifetime of our application and our component. These are properties, arguments, so like anything that is set externally on our components, but also lifecycle hosts and event handling can change the state of application depending how we actually set it up, as well as dependency injections that actually make it possible to manipulate state over the application. We will see what this means like later on as well. And as well, data loading is actually possible in our components as well using the router service. And depending on the kind of component that you're currently writing, it might actually lean to one or the other end of the spectrum of a more presentation component that mostly manages the state with properties and arguments, or on the other hand, a component that actually owns a lot of data, maybe it has like its own data loading pattern, and will therefore also have state that it can pass down like to other components and manage this on its own. And as data ownership, I define for this talk to kind of like talk about it, any kind of objects, for example, components that actually own state. They have like their own data stored on themselves, and they also have like methods available that actually allow them to manipulate this state themselves. And as many of you actually might realize, just like working as developers and as Ember developers, state management can sometimes not be that easy. And this is probably not like the fitting kind of like image, probably it should be look more like this, right? Sometimes it can actually be really difficult. And this has nothing to do with you not being like an efficient and competent developer. This is literally just because these topics are quite hard, and especially as an application grows in complexity and a lot of different interactions between like states exist, a lot of different state spaces, like the set of like possibilities that your application can actually be in rises, and therefore it becomes hard to actually reason about it. But luckily, frameworks like Ember, for example, can help us actually to maintain this and make it like much more easy for us. But first of all, let's look at the common problems that we actually incur and that we have to deal with when we try to manage state. Some of the common symptoms that you might see in your application are stuff like cyclical, I'm actually not sure, it's like cyclic or cyclical. You know what I'm saying, right? Data flows, but also race conditions where a property, for example, is set by different processes and it's sometimes not clear at which value it's actually going to end up. Also overall unpredictable behavior where you kind of go like, okay, where's this coming from, or why is it currently in this state? I don't understand why this even happened. And sometimes it can be really hard to debug these kind of problems as well. And last but not least, if we have trouble with managing state, it can sometimes also happen that we experience low performance in our application, and it's sometimes hard also to reason about why this is actually happening. And I think one of the main concepts of trying to manage state and make it like easier for us to reason about it is trying to improve the predictability of state in our application and actually make it easier for us to understand where state is coming from, where it's set, and also how we can, in the end, also like test it. Also nice picture in the background there. I have here like an interesting example that can already highlight a very nice new concept that's introduced in Ember Octane, which helps us to reason about initial component state. If you, for example, had a component, something like this, like a simple template, where we, if the condition I have packed is true, can either display like a list of items, here like an inventory, or if this condition is false, we can just like display like a simple string. If we look at this, we kind of go like, okay, seems quite reasonable, pretty straightforward, I know what's happening here. And then we might, for example, have like a route that loads like this data, for example, just like this list of items that we want to pack for our EmberCamp, some tents, some water bottles. And then when we actually invoke this component with the model that we have provided in the template context, then we will then we will actually see this list actually being rendered on the page. So this is really straightforward, nothing kind of like confusing happening here. But what actually happens if we now don't pass anything in? Like if we don't pass like something into our component, then we would kind of like expect, well, we didn't pass in kind of like an inventory for the property that is actually required to display it, so probably it should be empty. But then when we look at it again and see it like in the page, then we see actually something is rendered, and we don't get this, but instead we see something like this. And then we go like, this is like a little bit confusing, so why is this going on? And as Ember developer that already spent some time, you kind of go like, well, I have to look into my component.js file, obviously. And then you find there's a computer where you just like return like a default value in case that, for example, you have not passed anything else externally into a component. And this is something that you kind of like get a hang of it like over time, but still it can trip you up every now and then. Every now and then you kind of go like, where's this coming from? And you have to look for it. In Ember Octane, we have this really cool new feature that's called named arguments. The RFC has already been submitted like already quite a while ago, has been accepted, and will be available like also in Ember Octane. And this actually allows you to reason about this in a much more straightforward way. The named argument is any kind of like argument that you have in a template that is like preceded like with an @ sign. And for example, in a template as such, we can define any kind of property that is passed in externally to the component with the named argument syntax. And for example, inventory that is passed in now becomes @inventory. And therefore, it's like very clear to us just like by looking at the template where the data is actually coming from, and we don't have to wonder anymore and like look into a component.js file that is like somewhere in our app where this is actually coming from. And we can also use this arguments API to also do stuff in our component.js file. For example, this conditional with like has inventory can also check if we actually have like this args inventory set, and depending on this, we actually change something conditional. And also interesting to note here as well, oftentimes what you did in that classic Ember components is actually provide like a default value by setting like any kind of property on your component.js file. You can also do something similar with the named argument syntax and just like make sure that any kind of like values that you use in the template that have a default value are actually defined by a getter. Here, for example, the internal inventory getter. So this makes it quite straightforward to us to already see where initial state is coming from. But what about updating state? What is actually happening as our component lives on in the application and properties are changed or a state is changed, and how can we reason about this like much more easily? If we go back, for example, to the example with this EmberCamp that actually can take on like an argument, we can, for example, use angle bracket invocation syntax first of all, like if some of you kind of like now go, okay, where's this coming from? This is also something that's already available in Ember. You can already use it, but in Ember Octane, this will also be something that you will see in the guides and like in the API guides like very prominently. Works like very similar to classic component invocation, just like looks a little bit, more interesting. And yeah, exactly. And if you think about now how we want to update states in our applications, very traditional pattern that is already prominent like in the Ember community is something that comes to our mind. And it is about trying to separate like the concerns of either managing data or like passing down data to other parts of the application, and the other concern of trying to present this data on the user interface or maybe make it available like to user interaction. And in other communities, for example, can also be called the container component versus presentation component pattern. You can give it like a lot of different names. In Ember, we mostly talk about this pattern where you try to pass down data from one component, a controller or something, to another component, and this is what we call then data down, actions up. Just like as a quick recap, what this actually means is that we have like any kind of like parent, like a controller, maybe like a component that loads data and that owns data, that actually can pass down to a child component, something that is more presentational in its function, these arguments like this data. And also, as it actually does this, it also passes down actions. So like a function that the child component can use to also send up any kind of like updates to indicate there's an update, for example, because someone clicked a button to the parent component, and along with this actually also send a value with which the state should be updated. But the parent component always, or like the controller always decides how it will actually handle this update, not the presentation component. This also has the benefit that like components that you actually write that are presentational are much more reusable in a sense, and don't have to deal like with all the business logic of like handling the state. They just are there for the display. And the cool thing is with the arguments that we now have like in Ember Octane, it's also much more enforced or more encouraged to actually use data down actions up, because we cannot directly in our component actually update arguments themselves. It always have to come like from the parent that's actually passing down the arguments, and this is actually really neat. So what you would then, similarly to like classic Ember components will do, is like, for example, have like an action defined on your child component that actually takes the action that is passed down from the parent and will call it themselves, that you have like attached like also somewhere in your template, for example, like on a button. And using the on modifiers that are available in Octane, you also have a very easy way to say, okay, like this certain event should be fired, and when this is fired, I actually want to execute this action and also pass up like the value of this particular item. And this then also becomes like very straightforward, very similar to classic Ember components, just like with another syntax, and also the encouragement from the framework for you to actually do it and not kind of say, maybe this time I'm just going to set it on the child component. You actually are encouraged to do it now. And the cool thing is, similarly as well, this does not only apply to component-to-component interaction or like controller-component interaction. Also, if we think about like how we want to update like states, like application-wise, we can do something similar. It's not called like data down actions up really, but the pattern is quite similar. If you think about, for example, like a service that owns like any kind of state that can be propagated to a lot of like different components or UI elements in the application, then you can, for example, also inject this service into any kind of like component, for example, and then also update these values either directly, or you can also create a helper method on your service that actually takes care of it, which I personally very favor, because it makes it much more easier as well to actually find the places in your applications where data is owned and also where it's handled without you having to look too much about where the update is actually coming from. And if you look at an example, you could, for example, have a service that has like a property current time that is displayed in different places of the application, and then also this helper method like reset time, where you actually set this time to another value when it's actually executed. And also here, interesting to note is like this track decorator, and this actually helps us in Ember Octane applications to indicate that this value can change, and this is also quite relevant for performance optimization in your components, but we can take a look at this also like later on. And also with this, you can finally, when we have the service, inject this into your components, and then using an action, you can, for example, say, okay, I just want to use this method on the service. Then it's also quite clear where you actually have to look now for the state updates. You actually just have to go to the service to see what is going on here. And this also makes it possible with service injections for us to change like application-wide state in the component without relaying too much of the responsibility of owning and managing the state into the component itself. And the encouragement to use data down actions up has like a lot of like great benefits in our Ember Octane components. First of all, it encourages us to actually not have like cyclic data flows, but instead view data flow as more something like a tree, like something that's unidirectional and therefore much more predictable in its updates. We also have like an easier separation of concerns between like presentational and data owning elements in our application. And last but not least, also, which I didn't show an example before, but this is also quite interesting. If you have like named arguments, it's also not possible accidentally to override computed properties, which you could do in classic Ember components. If you have a property, you just like set it externally, then sometimes you would like blow up like a computer and wonder, okay, why does it not update anymore? This is not possible anymore in modern Ember components. And looking at how we can be more understanding about what's happening in the application, is also something that comes to mind in regards to APIs and how clear they're actually to us. And in regards to components, we also have like a lot of like great benefits from using Ember Octane, which are, for example, the possibility to benefit from a much leaner component API. With Glimmer components that are shipped with Ember Octane, you now have a much more reduced set of event handlers, to be specific, none anymore, but also lifecycle hooks and properties, which make it much easier for you to actually set your own properties, your own event handlers, either in a component or using the element modifiers like on in your templates themselves, without having to wonder how like an event or any kind of other lifecycle hook automatically actually change something in your state. And being able to not having to wonder where actually, for example, like event handler is already set up, or having to look for a property, maybe like in a superclass, makes it also much more predictable for you to write components and then also know what this component is actually doing without having to dig too much into the specific of the component class that you're using. And also, yeah, the single location of hooks is what actually makes this like so interesting to see. So this is like the screen off button. Cool. If you want to learn more about this, feel free to check out the RFC 416. It's a very great write-up by Chris Garrett that goes into full detail into the detailed design of the Glimmer components, and might also be helpful for you to better understand what the motivation is behind it. It's a very great read. And last but not least, I also want to take a look at performance in our application, and also how we can actually facilitate performance in our app by writing components that are very fast and don't relay too much work on the browser to actually render. I think there are like three main wins that we actually take out of Ember Octane when we write components, and I want to take a look first of all at like template-only components. This is also based on an RFC that has been submitted already a while ago, 278, and it defines that if you, for example, create in your Ember application a component that is only consists of a template and not like a component.js file, then that this component will not, if you render it like some of your application, will create its own dedicated component instance, which will then also save memory in the browser and therefore make your application like in some more performant. And template-owned components is also something that you can use in Ember Octane, and it's very useful if you just want to actually present data to the UI and don't have to actually manage or like own state in the component itself. Also, if we think about how we can benefit from what the browser and also like the JavaScript engine is already giving us, thinking about how actually our application is cleaned up and memory is freed is also very important. And this is maybe not very Ember Octane specific, but also something to keep in mind in general if you actually write a component. Being able to really think about where state lives and where it's actually like relevant is like very crucial for this, because every time a component actually is inserted in your DOM and then later on also removed, it can actually be picked up by the garbage collection of the JavaScript engine in your browser and actually free up memory. So if you know there's like a certain state, like for example, I don't know, maybe like a property of like showing you a list of items for like a certain page, and you know it's really only like this single component that actually relies on this data, actually putting the state into this component is very beneficial to make sure that it's not like hanging around some application where it's not used anymore. And this is also very good to keep in mind. And last but not least, also rendering can have like a very big impact into your performance, as the browser actually has to not only run your JavaScript, but also has to trigger like new relayouts and like new re-renders of the page. It actually takes time and memory and energy to do that, and you actually want to avoid like repeated rendering. There are a lot of like things that already classic Ember components already did for you to make sure that it doesn't actually cause too many re-renders, but I think the new API in Ember Octane components makes it even much more straightforward. As you write Ember Octane components, you might realize that any kind of like properties that you want to declare as being something that might impact changes actually have to explicitly declare it for you as such. So if you declare a property and you just try to update it, it won't work unless you explicitly say, hey, like this is, by the way, a track property now, and I want you to actually, when this property is updated, to re-render the parts of the template that rely on this certain property. And by making this explicitly opt-in, it's also much easier for you to not forget about any kind of property, not about like a certain property, not updating like a certain part of the template. Yeah. And this is like also really great because it really trims down the amount of like rendering in your page automatically. And with this said, just like a quick recap, what we covered so far. We have been looking at like data ownership and how actually named arguments can really help us with distinguishing where data should actually be owned, and also the encouragement of data down actions up by not being able to set arguments directly on the component itself. We have like improved separation of concerns between like presentation and also like data owning components. We also had a look at the Glimmer component API that is much more trimmed down and makes it like easier for us to reason about like where events are actually handled and where we actually define events in our component class, and also the prevention against accidentally computed property overrides with named arguments, and it's like very beneficial as well for us to write like much more predictable components. We saw that we can still modify application by state, and we saw also some patterns how we can actually facilitate to find out where data that application byte is owned and also managed. And last but not least, also Ember Octane provides us with several cool new features that make it much easier for us to write performant components and therefore also performant applications. And with this said, I hope you already got like a little bit like a sneak peek into what is coming with Ember Octane. Ember Octane is around the corner very, very soon. I'm not sure if Jen will also talk a little bit about like in the may I ask a question, so I will not try to say like too much about it, but it's a very exciting time, and if you can, be sure to actually check it out and see how this actually works for you and your application. And with this said, thank you so much and have a great time at EmberCamp.